Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping back 1,000 years into the scorching Sonoran Desert, long before air conditioning, before steel tools, before written records told the world what happened here. You are standing barefoot on cracked earth, under a merciless sun that could kill you in hours without water. But you're not afraid, because you are Hohokam. You are a master of water, in a land that wants you dead. While Romans built their famous aqueducts across stone hills, your ancestors were carving over 700 miles of irrigation canals through solid caliche rock using nothing but sharpened stone and wooden digging sticks. Tonight, you'll experience what they never taught you in school. The Hohokam civilization that transformed an unforgiving desert into agricultural paradise, then defended it with brutal efficiency when enemies came for their water. So dim the lights, settle into your pillows, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, because for the next hour, you won't be there anymore. You'll be breathing dust, tasting copper water, feeling the weight of a stone-tipped war club in your calloused hands, and you'll understand why some engineering marvels were worth killing for. You are 15 summers old when the elders first take you to see the Mother Canal at dawn, and the sight steals your breath in ways the desert heat never could. The main channel stretches westward toward the rising sun, a perfectly straight line cut 8 feet deep into the earth, its walls so smooth they seem almost polished despite being carved with stone tools. Your grandfather's grandfather once wielded. The water inside flows with deliberate purpose, neither rushing wastefully nor stagnating into mosquito-breeding stillness. And you can hear the soft whisper of it against the earthen walls like a conversation between the canal and the desert itself. Your uncle, a master canal keeper named Broken Tooth, gestures for you to climb down into the empty inspection channel that runs parallel to the water, and your bare feet find purchase on the carved footholds that generations of workers have worn smooth. Down here, the engineering precision becomes even more obvious as you see the gentle gradient, just enough to keep water moving but not enough to cause erosion, calculated by men who never knew mathematics as the Romans did. But understood water with an intimacy that came from survival. The walls tower above you, and you notice the careful layering of different soils, each chosen for specific water holding or drainage properties, knowledge passed down through centuries of observation and fatal trial and error. Broken Tooth's weathered hand touches the canal wall almost reverently, his fingers tracing invisible lines only he can see, and he tells you that your family has kept this section flowing for 6 generations. World that your grandfather once fought off Salado raiders, right here where you're standing, that the dark stains on the upper walls are not just watermarks, but also blood from that defense. You realize then that being chosen as a canal keeper apprentice means more than learning to move water through the desert. It means you are 15 summers old when the elders first take you to see the Mother Canal at dawn, and the sight steals your breath in ways the desert heat never could. The main channel stretches westward toward the rising sun, a perfectly straight line cut 8 feet deep into the earth, its walls so smooth they seem almost polished despite being carved with stone tools. Your grandfather's grandfather once wielded. The water inside flows with deliberate purpose, neither rushing wastefully nor stagnating into mosquito-breeding stillness, and you can hear the soft whisper of it against the earthen walls like a conversation between the canal and the desert itself. Your uncle, a master canal keeper named Broken Tooth, gestures for you to climb down into the empty inspection channel that runs parallel to the water, and your bare feet find purchase on the carved footholds that generations of workers have worn smooth. Down here, the engineering precision becomes even more obvious as you see the gentle gradient, just enough to keep water moving but not enough to cause erosion, calculated by men who never knew mathematics as the Romans did, but understood water with an intimacy that came from survival. The walls tower above you, and you notice the careful layering of different soils, each chosen for specific water holding or drainage properties, and knowledge passed down through centuries of observation and fatal trial and error. Broken Tooth's weathered hand touches the canal wall almost reverently, his fingers tracing invisible lines only he can see, and he tells you that your family has kept this section flowing for 6 generations, that your grandfather once fought off Salado raiders right here where you're standing, that the dark stains on the upper walls are not just watermarks, but also blood from that defense. You realize then that being chosen as a canal keeper apprentice means more than learning to move water through the desert. Means 3 moons pass and your hands develop the thick calluses of a working canal keeper. Your shoulders broaden from moving earth and stone, and you begin to understand why the Hohokam people have survived in this merciless desert for centuries, while other tribes come and go like summer storms. The secret is not just the canals themselves, but the intricate social structure that maintains them, a structure built on shared labor and shared consequence where every family in the village takes turns working canal maintenance because everyone understands that a breach in your section means disaster for your neighbors downstream. Every 5th day, you join 30 other workers in a communal cleaning effort, and you learn the songs they sing to coordinate the rhythmic swing of digging sticks, ancient melodies that help the work flow like the water you're protecting. The master engineer of your village, a woman named Cloud Singer, who earned her position through 30 years of perfect maintenance record, inspects your work one morning and runs her fingers along the canal wall you've just repaired, her touch so practiced she can feel imperfections invisible to your young eyes. She nods slowly, a gesture of approval rarely given, and explains that the Romans built their aqueducts with stone and not concrete that will last forever but require slaves to construct, while the Hohokam build with earth and knowledge that makes every citizen invested in the system's survival. You realize this is not just engineering, but social engineering, a way of organizing human cooperation that works. Because failure is not an abstract concept, but immediate and deadly. That afternoon, Cloud Singer takes you to see the main distribution point where the mother canal splits into 7 smaller channels, each one carefully measured to receive a precise fraction of the total flow based on agreements hammered out through generations of negotiation and occasionally bloodshed between villages. The distribution gates are made of carefully shaped wood and stone, and adjusting them requires the consensus of representatives from all 7 villages, a system that prevents any single community from hoarding water during drought years. You watch as these representatives arrive for their monthly meeting, middle-aged men and women with faces like carved sandstone, and you notice they all carry weapons despite this being a peaceful gathering, because water rights are sacred and disputes must be prevented before they begin. The dry season arrives with winds that scour exposed skin like obsidian blades, and the great Gila River that feeds your mother canal begins to shrink daily until its normal broad expanse becomes a braided series of channels separated by growing islands of cracked mud. This is when your training becomes deadly serious because maintaining adequate flow in the canals requires constantly adjusting the river intake gates, a dangerous task that claims lives every year when workers slip on wet rocks or miscalculate the river's remaining force. Broken Tooth takes you to the intake structure, a massive construction of woven brush, stones, and wooden posts driven deep into the riverbed that angles water away from the main current and into the canal mouth, and you're struck by how temporary it looks compared to the permanent Roman dams you've heard travelers describe. But Broken Tooth explains the brilliance of this temporary design as you both wade into the thigh-deep water, feeling the current pull at your legs with surprising strength, despite the river's reduced flow. The intake structure must be flexible enough to partially collapse during the summer flood season when the Gila transforms into a raging torrent that would destroy any permanent dam, then rebuilt stronger during low water when every drop becomes precious. This means the intake keeper, currently a hard-faced man named Stonefist who lost 3 fingers to a flood 10 years ago, must read the river's moods like you read the canal's whispers, knowing exactly when to reinforce which sections and when to let them deliberately fail to prevent total destruction. You watch Stonefist work with practiced efficiency, adding bundles of brush to sections where the current is cutting too deeply, removing stones from areas where water needs to flow more freely toward the canal intake, constantly balancing natural force against human need. He sends you underwater to check a support post that might be loosening, and you take a deep breath and dive into the murky brown water, your hands finding the post and feeling how it vibrates in its socket from the current's pressure. When you surface, gasping and coughing muddy water, Stonefist nods with satisfaction and tells you that fear is good because it keeps you alert, but panic is death because it makes you stupid. And working the river requires you to live in the space between those two extremes every single day. Your first real test comes 6 moons into your apprenticeship, when scouts arrive in the pre-dawn darkness with news that makes every adult in the village immediately grab weapons and move toward the canals with deadly purpose. A band of approximately 40 Salado people from the mountains to the east has been spotted traveling down the river corridor, and their trajectory suggests they're heading toward either your main intake structure or possibly attempting to breach the mother canal itself to flood their own smaller, inferior channels at your. This is not an uncommon occurrence because the Salado, despite being distant cousins to your people, never developed the engineering knowledge or social organization required to build and maintain an efficient irrigation system, so they periodically resort to theft or sabotage, gambling that quick raids can steal enough water or destroy enough infrastructure to tilt the balance in their favor. Broken Tooth arms you with a war club made from hardwood and studded with sharp stones, a weapon you've trained with in practice but never imagined using against actual human beings. And the weight of it in your hands feels entirely different. How that blood might actually flow. The village defense force assembles at the main canal, about 60 fighters ranging from boys barely older than you to gray-haired veterans, like Cloudsinger who carries a spear with practiced ease despite her age. And you realize that every canal keeper is expected to be a warrior because protecting water is protecting life itself. The strategy session is brief and efficient, led by War Chief Burning Sky, whose face bears scars from at least 3 previous canal battles, and he positions fighters at key points where the Salado would most likely attempt their sabotage based on decades of accumulated tactical knowledge. You're assigned to a defensive position with 5 others at a vulnerable section where the canal bank is lower and therefore easier to breach. And as the sun rises and heat begins to build, you crouch behind a low adobe wall built specifically for this purpose and watch the eastern approach with your heart hammering against your ribs. Hours pass in terrible silence, broken only by the eternal whisper of water through the canal and the occasional call of a desert bird, and you begin to understand that warfare in the desert is not the glorious combat of songs and stories, but rather the grinding tension of waiting and watching while thirst builds and muscles cramp, knowing that sudden violence might erupt at any moment or never come at all. Because the enemy saw your preparations and chose to raid a different village instead, the Salado attack comes not where the war chief expected, but from the opposite direction, a diversionary force that shows these raiders possess more tactical sophistication than previous seasons, and you hear the war cry echo down the canal line before you actually see the enemy. Burning Sky immediately recognizes the trap and redeploys half the force westward while maintaining defensive positions at the eastern approaches, showing the fluid tactical thinking that keeps his people alive, and you find yourself running along the canal bank with your uncle and 20 others. Toward the sound of actual combat for the first time in your young life. The distance is perhaps half a mile, but feels endless as not your sandaled feet pound the hard-packed earth beside the canal, your war club feeling heavier with each stride, your breath coming in gasps that have nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the primal fear of imminent violence. Your uncle doesn't break stride but plunges directly into the combat. Out his war club, rising and falling with practiced efficiency against a Salado warrior who turns too late to fully defend himself, and you see Broken Tooth's weapon connect with the man's shoulder in a blow that clearly breaks bone and draws a scream of pain that sounds exactly like a scream from your own people, because pain is the same regardless of which tribe you belong to. Your body moves before your mind catches up, some deep training reflex taking over, and you find yourself engaging a Salado warrior barely older than yourself, who has similar fear in his eyes, and in that moment you realize he's not a monster or an abstract enemy, but just another desperate person trying to survive in a desert that offers no easy choices. Though that realization doesn't stop you from swinging your club at his head with all your strength. The combat lasts perhaps 4 minutes in reality, though time distorts, until it feels both instantaneous and eternal, and when your club connects with the Salado youth's forearm instead of his head because he raises it to block at the last possible moment, you hear bones snap with a sound like a dry branch breaking, and his weapon tumbles from suddenly useless fingers into the canal with a small splash that somehow seems louder than the screaming. He stumbles backward and you could kill him. Now, he's defenseless and shocked with his broken arm, hanging at an unnatural angle, but something in his face stops you. Perhaps recognition that he's someone's nephew being taught to survive, just as Broken Tooth teaches you, and instead you kick his legs from under him and leave him gasping in the dust while you turn to help Cornflower, who's struggling against 2 opponents simultaneously. But the fight is already essentially over because the arrival of reinforcements has shifted the numerical advantage decisively to the Hohokam defenders, and the remaining Salado raiders are scrambling back toward the desert scrub that offers cover and escape routes, dragging their wounded when possible and abandoning them when necessary. Burning Sky lets them retreat without pursuit, understanding that wounded enemies who return to their village carry the message that this canal system remains too well defended to raid successfully, a more effective deterrent than killing every raider would be. The silence after combat is somehow more terrible than the noise during it, broken only by the groaning of the injured from both sides, and the eternal whisper of water that never stopped flowing, even when men were dying to control it. You look down at the Salado youth you defeated and see he's perhaps 13 summers younger than you, and his eyes hold no hatred but rather the dull shock of pain and the humiliation of failure that will mark him within his tribe for seasons to come. Broken Tooth appears beside you, breathing hard but unwounded, and he places a hand on your shoulder with something like pride in his eyes. as he surveys your first combat. Then he gestures toward the wounded Hohokam defender still in the canal, and together you wade into the blood-brown water to pull him out. And you realize this is your life, now, the endless cycle of maintaining water and defending it, of building and fighting, of engineering and warfare that keeps your people alive on a land that wants them dead. The wounded defender you and Broken Tooth pull from the canal is named Red Clay, a man of perhaps 25 summers who has kept canals since he could walk, and the wound in his side leaks blood with a steady pulse that, from hunting injuries, means a major vessel has been cut. The village healer, an ancient woman called Gentle Hands, whose actual age no one knows because she was old when your grandparents were children, arrives within minutes and immediately begins packing the wound with a mixture of crushed herbs, knot, and spiderweb silk, while chanting in a language older than the canals themselves. You watch her work with fascinating horror as she probes the wound, with fingers so practiced they seem to see better than eyes, locating the damaged vessel and applying pressure with a technique that looks almost casual but must be precise, or Red Clay will bleed out right here beside the water. He spent his life protecting 3 other Hohokam defenders, suffered injuries ranging from broken bones to deep cuts, while the Salado left behind 2 dead warriors and 5 wounded, including the youth you defeated. And now comes the complex moral calculus that governs desert warfare. Burning Sky orders the Salado dead to be carried away from the canal, and left in a specific location where their people will find them for proper burial rites. This being a custom that prevents blood feuds from escalating beyond the sustainable level. Of raiding and counter-raiding that both sides have learned to live with. The wounded Salado prisoners receive basic treatment from Gentle Hands, with the same herbs and spider silk used on Hohokam injured, because allowing wounded enemies to die from neglect is seen as dishonorable and likely to provoke the kind of total warfare that would destroy both societies. You help carry the young Salado warrior with the broken arm to the shade of a ramada where he and the other prisoners are guarded, but given water and food. And up close you notice details that make him seem even more human and less like an abstract enemy. His war paint is applied carefully in patterns that must mean something to his people. His breechcloth is woven with skill equal to Hohokam work, and around his neck hangs a small clay pendant shaped like a mountain lion that looks exactly like the one your younger brother wears, except carved by different hands. He watches you with wary eyes, and you watch him back, and no words pass between you because you share no common language beyond the universal language of pain and survival. But you both understand that next season or next year you might be killing each other. Again, because the desert offers barely enough water for one thriving civilization, let alone 2. The days following combat feel strange because life must immediately return to normal maintenance rhythms despite the trauma freshly carved into your memory, and you find yourself mechanically checking canal walls and clearing silt, while your mind keeps replaying the moment your club connected with human bone, the way the Salado youth's eyes looked in that instant of pain, the copper smell of blood mixed with canal water. Broken Tooth seems to understand this without words being spoken, and he works beside you in companionable silence that asks nothing but offers steady presence. And gradually the rhythm of labor begins to smooth the sharp edges. Now, of memory, the way water smooths stone over centuries of patient flowing. Red Clay survives his wound thanks to Gentle Hands' skill, though he will carry a puckered scar that restricts his movement, and prevents him from performing the most strenuous canal work. So he transitions to becoming a teacher who trains younger apprentices. In the theoretical knowledge, while others handle the physical labor. The Salado prisoners are kept for 3 days while messages are sent to their village negotiating terms of return, this being a carefully choreographed process that has evolved over generations, not of conflict, and contains its own rigid customs and expectations. The ransom demanded is not wealth or goods, but rather labor. Specifically, that the Salado village must send workers to help repair a section of secondary canal that serves the southern fields, this being considered both practical compensation and a teaching opportunity where the Salado workers will observe proper engineering techniques they might then implement in their own inferior system. The young warrior with the broken arm is ransomed first because of his age, and before he leaves, he catches your eye across the village plaza and gives you a slight nod that might be respect or might be a promise of future revenge. You can't tell which, and perhaps he can't either. That evening, as the sun sets in spectacular colors that paint the desert in shades of orange and purple that would be beautiful if you had any energy left to notice them, Cloudsinger calls together all the defenders who fought and performs a cleansing ceremony that involves smoke from sacred plants and water from the deepest part of the Mother Canal. She chants words that acknowledge the weight of taking life, or nearly taking it, that honor the necessity of defense without glorifying the violence, and that remind everyone present that the canals they're protecting represent life itself for thousands of people who depend on the water flowing through them. You feel the smoke sting your eyes and the sacred water cool on your face, and something tight in your chest loosens slightly as you realize you're not alone in carrying the burden of what you've done. Character appearance: you wear work clothes again, dusty and tired, your expression showing the 1,000-yard stare of someone processing trauma. Red Clay sits on the canal bank teaching younger apprentices, his side bandaged, moving stiffly. Cloudsinger performs the cleansing ceremony, wearing an elaborate ceremonial dress with shell decorations. Her face painted with sacred symbols. A full cycle of seasons passes and you grow from apprentice to junior canal keeper with your own assigned section to maintain, though Broken Tooth still supervises your work and will for several more years, until you've proven yourself through every variation of flood, drought, and attack that the desert can throw at you. Your section is only a half-mile length of secondary canal that branches off the mother channel to serve 23 agricultural plots, but you treat it with the same obsessive attention that master keepers give the main arteries, because you've learned that the entire system only functions when every section receives equal devotion. Each morning you walk your length before dawn, listening to the water song, checking for breaches or blockages or the subtle changes in flow that indicate problems developing somewhere upstream, and you've begun to hear the differences that once eluded your untrained ears, the way a hunter learns to distinguish different animal tracks in dust. The way the agricultural plots you serve grow primarily corn, beans, and squash, in the traditional Three Sisters combination, but also cotton for weaving and amaranth for grain, all planted in carefully designed fields that incorporate small catchment basins and distribution channels to ensure even watering without waste. You learn the farmers' schedules and needs, understanding that the woman called Bright Star needs slightly more water flow on the 3rd day of each week to flood her lower field where she grows rice grass for basket material, while the man named Tall Pine requires less water but delivered more frequently to his rocky slope where he cultivates agave for fiber and eventually for the fermented drink consumed during ceremonies. This intimate knowledge of every water user in your section makes you part engineer, part administrator, and part mediator when disputes arise over who received too much or too little water during the critical growing season. The summer monsoons arrive with dramatic suddenness that transforms the usually predictable desert into a dangerous landscape of flash floods and lightning, and you experience your first flood control crisis when the Gila River rises 10 feet in less than 4 hours and threatens to overwhelm the intake structure with silt-laden water that could choke the entire canal system if allowed to enter. Stone Fist leads the emergency response team that includes you and 15 others, and together you work in driving rain that feels like needles against exposed skin to partially close the intake gates and divert the worst of the flood away from the canals. A desperate and dangerous operation that requires workers to stand waist deep in raging current while lightning splits the dark sky above them, and everyone knows that one mistake means being swept away to certain death. Downstream, the flood surge passes after 6 hours of exhausting labor, leaving behind a transformed landscape where the normally brown desert is temporarily painted green with new growth that erupts from seeds that waited years for exactly this much moisture, and the canals run fuller than you've ever seen them, though the water is too silt-laden to use directly on crops until it settles and clears. No one from your crew died during the intake control operation, though 2 workers suffered broken bones from being slammed against the structure by the current, and Stonefist dislocated his shoulder but simply had gentle hands wrench it back into socket and returned to work the same day because flood aftermath requires as much attention as the flood itself. The canals now need to be walked constantly to check for breaches caused by the surging pressure, for new erosion patterns that could become catastrophic weaknesses, for debris blockages where tree branches and unfortunate animals were swept into the system. You discover your first major breach during the afternoon walk, a section of bank that simply collapsed under the hydraulic pressure, where an underground animal burrow created a hidden weakness, and now water is pouring through a gap as wide as your outstretched arms into a low-lying area that will become a stagnant swamp if not stopped immediately. This is your responsibility, your section, and you must handle it, even though the repair will require moving perhaps 2 tons of earth and stone before sunset, or the breach will widen overnight to the point of requiring communal labor to fix. You sprint back to your storage area and gather the tools and materials you've learned to keep prepared for exactly this situation. And then you begin the grinding work of clay and stone. Placement that will consume the next 6 hours of your life. Broken Tooth appears after the first hour, says nothing, just begins working beside you with practiced efficiency that doubles the repair speed, and you realize this is how knowledge truly transfers in your culture, not through lengthy explanations, but through shared labor and observed technique. Other canal keepers from adjacent sections stop by to assess your work and offer occasional suggestions, forming a loose collaborative network where individual responsibility combines with collective support, and you begin to understand that the social engineering of your people is as sophisticated as the physical engineering of the canals themselves. As the sun sets, you place the final stones that will hold the clay in position until it fully seals, and Broken Tooth examines your work in the fading light and grunts approval, which from him is equivalent to elaborate praise, and you feel a deep satisfaction that has nothing to do with glory, and everything to do with having protected the water that keeps your people alive. 3 summers pass in a rhythm of maintenance, defense, and occasional combat that becomes the pattern of your adult life, and you grow into a full canal keeper with a reputation for meticulous work and quick thinking during crisis situations. You're now counted among the 50 defenders who respond when raiding threats emerge, and you've fought the Salado twice more and once a different group from the north called the Sinagua, who attempted to sabotage the distribution gates during a drought year. That particular fight was brutal because drought desperation makes people reckless, and you took an atlatl dart through your shoulder that gentle hands removed, with less ceremony than you expected, simply cutting it out while you bit down on a leather strap and then packing the wound with the same herb mixture she uses on everyone, regardless of whether they're important war chiefs or junior keepers who made a mistake in positioning. The irrigation system you maintain has expanded during these years. New branches added as population grows and agricultural techniques improve, and you've participated in the construction of 2 new secondary canals that required the kind of surveying precision your people have perfected over centuries. The process begins with the senior engineers like Cloudsinger walking the proposed route using a water-level device made of connected tubes and marked sticks to determine the exact gradient needed, a technique that looks primitive compared to Roman instruments you've heard described, but produces equally accurate results through sheer patience and accumulated knowledge. Then comes the actual digging. Dozens of workers moving earth in coordinated rhythm, while singers maintain the work pace and water. Carriers ensure no one succumbs to the relentless heat that kills careless workers with depressing regularity. You've also begun teaching apprentices of your own, currently 2 boys and a girl who follow you through morning inspections with the same mixture of eagerness and terror you remember from your early days with Broken Tooth, and you find yourself unconsciously repeating his lessons about listening to water and reading subtle signs that indicate developing problems. The girl named Quick Rabbit for her ability to run messages faster than anyone else. Her age shows particular promise in understanding hydraulics and flow rates, asking questions that indicate she's thinking beyond simple maintenance toward actual system improvements. You encourage this because your people's survival depends on each generation maintaining and expanding the knowledge of the previous one, creating an upward spiral of capability that has already turned your civilization into the most sophisticated water managers in the entire known world the year you turn 22 summers. A drought begins that will test every aspect of your civilization's water management capabilities and social cohesion, and it starts innocuously enough with the summer monsoons arriving 3 weeks late, which is unusual but not unprecedented in your lifetime. But then the monsoons themselves are weak, bringing perhaps half the normal rainfall, and the Gila River's flow drops to levels you've never seen, reducing the normally broad waterway to a series of disconnected pools separated by expanses of cracked mud that stretch for hundreds of paces. Stone Fist calls an emergency meeting of all intake keepers and explains with characteristic bluntness that at current flow rates, the river cannot support the full canal system at normal capacity, which means the Council of Villages must implement water rationing protocols that haven't been used since your grandfather's youth. The rationing system your people have developed over centuries is brutally fair in its distribution of scarcity, with every family receiving a strictly measured water allocation based on field size and crop type, and with violators facing immediate exile regardless of their status, or connections, because hoarding water during drought is considered equivalent to murder. You become part of the enforcement system, conducting surprise inspections of fields and household storage vessels to ensure no one is taking more than their share. And it's miserable work because you're essentially policing your neighbors and friends, checking whether Bright Star's watering her rice grass field on the correct days, or whether tall pine is filling extra storage jars when he thinks no one is watching. Most people comply because they understand the mathematics of survival. But you catch 3 families cheating and must report them to the council, knowing your report will result in exile into the desert during the worst possible season. The social strain manifests in increased tensions during the communal work. Details that normally bind the villages together through shared labor, with accusations and counter-accusations flying about who is working hard enough or who is strategically positioning themselves near the water sources to steal occasional extra mouthfuls. Broken Tooth, now graying and moving a bit slower, but still formidable, tells you this is the true test of a civilization, not how well it functions during abundance, but whether it holds together when scarcity threatens to tear apart the social bonds that make large-scale irrigation possible. He reminds you that isolated families cannot build or defend canal systems. Only organized communities can, which means maintaining community cohesion is as important as maintaining the actual infrastructure, perhaps more important because infrastructure can be rebuilt if the people survive, but people cannot survive if the infrastructure is seized by those who would control water for personal advantage. 4 moons into the drought, the inevitable happens when scouts report a large combined force of approximately 100 Salado and Sinagua warriors moving toward your territory, clearly planning a major assault on the canal system, while your people are weakened by water scarcity and internal strain. War Chief Burning Sky, now showing his age but still commanding respect through decades of successful defense, calls for every capable fighter to assemble, and you find yourself among 60 defenders who must protect of vulnerable canal infrastructure against nearly double your number of desperate attackers. The strategic situation is bleak because drought affects everyone equally, meaning the raiders are just as desperate as your own people, and desperate enemies take risks that well-fed enemies never would, making them simultaneously more dangerous and more predictable in their target selection. Burning Sky's defense plan is ruthlessly pragmatic in ways that make you sick, but you understand are necessary, deciding to concentrate forces at only the 3 most critical points in the irrigation system: the main intake, the primary distribution gate, and the largest water storage reservoir, while essentially abandoning secondary positions that would require too many defenders spread too thin. This means that entire sections of lesser canals will go undefended and might be destroyed by the raiders, resulting in crop loss and potential starvation for some families. But defending everything means losing everything when you're outnumbered, so you sacrifice the few to save the many and live with the moral weight afterward. You're assigned to defend the main intake with Stonefist and 20 others, this being considered the most critical position, because if the intake falls, the entire system starves for water, regardless of whether downstream positions remain intact. The waiting before combat is somehow worse than the fighting itself, crouched behind defensive walls while the sun hammers down and water rationing. Dote means you're thirstier than you've ever been during a fight, your tongue thick in your mouth and your head beginning to pound, with the first stage of dehydration. Stone Fist shares his water ration with the younger fighters, though he's older and needs it more, this being a leadership technique you file away for when you eventually command your own defensive position, showing that leaders drink last and fight first. Quick Rabbit, your brightest apprentice, insisted on being included in the defense despite her youth and gender, and she's positioned as a runner who will carry messages between defensive positions. If the combat becomes chaotic, a role that sounds safe but actually exposes her to tremendous danger. If fighting spreads beyond the prepared positions, the combined Salados Nagua force attacks at noon. When the heat is most intense and defenders are most weakened by dehydration, showing tactical sophistication that suggests experienced war leaders guide this raid rather than the usual opportunistic bands. They come in 3 waves. The first being expendable young warriors meant to test your defenses and draw out your positions. The second being the main assault force that hits revealed weaknesses. And the third being a reserve held back to exploit breakthroughs or cover retreat. Depending on how the battle develops, you watch the first wave approach, perhaps 20 young fighters barely older than your apprentices, and you know that most of them will die or be maimed in the next few minutes purely to provide tactical information to their commanders, and this knowledge sits in your stomach like a stone because you remember being that young and terrified during your first raid defense. The first wave hits your position with desperate fury, and you find yourself fighting 2 attackers simultaneously, while Stone Fist's voice booms over the chaos coordinating defensive responses. Your war club connects with a Salado warrior's shield, hard enough to crack the woven material, and your follow-up strike catches him in the knee, a disabling blow rather than a killing one, and he goes down screaming while his companion tries to brain you with a stone-headed axe that you barely deflect with your own weapon. The impact sends shockwaves up your arm, and, you'll have bruises tomorrow, if you survive to see tomorrow. And then Broken Tooth is there, fighting beside you like he's done since you were 15, his older body still moving with practiced efficiency that makes up for decreased speed with better positioning and economy of motion. The first wave breaks after perhaps 10 minutes of brutal combat, the survivors retreating to drag their wounded back toward the main enemy position, and you use the brief respite to gulp water from a community pot and check yourself for injuries you might not have felt during the adrenaline surge of combat. Your knuckles are bleeding from where they scraped stone. During blocking, your shoulder aches where someone hit you with something you never even saw, and your chest protector shows a deep gouge where an obsidian blade came, within a finger width of opening your rib cage like a gutted rabbit. Stone Fist is bleeding from a shallow cut across his forearm, but otherwise intact, and he's already repositioning fighters to account for 2 defenders who went down during the first wave, one probably dead from a crushed skull, and the other badly wounded, but still breathing in horrible gasping sounds that make you want to help him, but you can't because the second wave is already forming up, and this one will be much worse. The second wave crashes into your position with overwhelming force. Approximately 40 experienced warriors who know exactly which sections of your defense were weakened during the first assault, and suddenly you're fighting for your life in a way that makes the first wave seem almost like a training exercise. A massive Sinagua warrior, at least a head taller than anyone else on the battlefield, makes straight for you, perhaps recognizing you as a key defender or perhaps just randomly selecting a target, and his war club is studded with obsidian blades that will not just crush but slice anything they connect with. And you realize with crystal clarity that you're about to die unless you do something perfect in the next 3 seconds. You drop low under his first massive swing, feeling the wind of the blow pass, so close it ruffles your hair, and you drive forward inside his reach, where his large club becomes a disadvantage, and you bring your own weapon up in a short, brutal arc into his unprotected groin with every bit of strength your desperate body can generate. The giant goes down with a sound somewhere between a scream and a gasp, and you don't wait to see if it's a disabling blow or merely a painful one, but instead pivot to help Broken Tooth, who's being driven back by 2 Salado fighters working in practice coordination that speaks of blood brotherhood, or maybe actual brotherhood. You catch one of them with a solid strike to a shoulder blade that likely breaks bone, but the other sees you coming and shifts to engage you instead of your uncle. And now you're trading blows with someone clearly more experienced than Dot. You, who's reading your attack patterns and starting to anticipate your moves, which is how fighters die, when opponents figure out your rhythm and insert killing blows into the predictable gaps. Broken Tooth takes advantage of the shift to re-engage with his original opponent, and for perhaps 30 seconds, you and your uncle fight back to minus. Back the way you've trained in practice sessions for years, and the training saves both your lives as you cover each other. It's vulnerable moments through perfect coordination, learned from countless hours of sweaty repetition. Then everything goes wrong simultaneously as a section of defensive wall collapses under concentrated enemy assault. Stone Fist goes down from a blow you don't see clearly, and suddenly enemies are inside your perimeter, and the defensive position starts fragmenting into individual combat. Clusters that lose the coordinated advantage that was keeping your smaller force effective against larger numbers. Quick Rabbit appears through the chaos, her young face splattered with someone's blood, though she's carrying no weapon, and she's screaming that the distribution gate position has completely fallen and enemies are destroying the control mechanism. Right now, and you realize with sick certainty that this battle is lost. The only question remaining is whether you can conduct an orderly retreat that preserves some fighting force, or whether this becomes a total massacre that leaves the water system completely undefended for follow-up destruction. Burning Sky's voice cuts through the chaos with a war horn blast that every defender recognizes as the retreat signal, and you feel simultaneous relief that you won't have to die here today, and crushing shame that you're abandoning the intake structure your people have maintained for 2 centuries to enemy destruction. The retreat is organized despite the chaos, because your people have trained for this nightmare scenario, defenders falling back in coordinated stages, while rear guards buy time with their lives for others to escape, and you find yourself in one of those rear guard positions because you're one of the younger, stronger fighters who has the best chance of disengaging and catching up to the retreating main force. Broken Tooth should retreat with the main group due to his age and wounds, but he refuses to leave while you're still fighting, standing beside you with dogged loyalty that makes you want to scream at him to save himself. But there's no time for arguments when enemies are pressing from 3 directions. You and 5 others, including your uncle, hold a narrow point where the trail away from the intake passes between 2 large rocks, creating a natural choke point that forces enemies to engage you in small numbers rather than overwhelming mass. And for perhaps 5 terrible minutes, you trade your bodies and blood for the time necessary for the main force to gain enough distance for safety. A Salado warrior nearly takes your head off with a sideways club swing that you barely duck, and your counterstrike misses completely because exhaustion is making you sloppy and slow. And then another defender named Bent Arrow takes an atlatl dart through his chest with a meaty thunk sound that will haunt your nightmares. And he looks surprised more than pained as he sits down, hard, and then topples sideways into the dust and lies still. Finally, the enemy pressure eases slightly, as their commanders presumably decide that slaughtering a rear guard is less important than seizing and destroying the intake infrastructure while they have time before Hohokam reinforcements might arrive from other villages, and the remaining 4 of you break contact and run, not the organized tactical retreat of soldiers, but the flat-out terrified sprint of people who know death is reaching for them, and distance is the only defense. You have carry Broken Tooth, who's taken a deep thigh wound at some point that you didn't notice during the combat, and is now bleeding badly and unable to run at full speed. And you realize with horror that the blood trail he's leaving is marking your path clearly for anyone who wants to follow. Another defender named Laughing Fox sees the problem and without a word uses his knife to open a cut on his own leg, then peels off in a different direction, leaving his own blood trail as a false lead, buying the rest of you precious minutes at the certain cost of his own life. When enemies follow his trail instead of yours, you reach the fallback position at the water storage reservoir. By pure stubbornness, and refusal to let Broken Tooth die after everything he's taught you, arriving with your uncle barely conscious from blood loss, and yourself so exhausted you can barely stand. Gentle Hands is already there treating the wounded, who arrived earlier, and she takes one look at Broken Tooth's thigh wound, and makes a sound you've never heard from her before, something between anger at the injury and grudging respect that he's still alive with a wound that should have killed him half a mile back. She cuts away his blood-soaked kilt without ceremony and begins packing the wound with her herb mixture while calling for assistance to hold him down. And you want to stay and help, but War Chief Burning Sky pulls you away. Because commanders need information more than wounded men need another hand holding them down. You make your report in short, factual sentences that contain none of the screaming terror you felt, or the grief for Laughing Fox's sacrifice, or the shame at losing the intake position, just the tactical information that Burning Sky needs to plan the next defensive stage. The main intake is lost, the primary distribution gate is destroyed, 2 secondary canals were sabotaged, but the damage extent is unknown, and you estimate 37 Hokum fighters killed or captured versus perhaps 55 enemy casualties based on the bodies you saw fall during your section of the fighting. Burning Sky listens without expression, his scarred face showing the accumulated weight of decades of such reports, and then he explains the new reality in equally emotionless terms that you both understand contain life or death implications for every person in your civilization. Without the main intake functional, the entire canal system will run dry within 4 days as the existing water volume flows out to fields and evaporates in the brutal heat, and the reservoir you're currently defending holds perhaps a 10-day water supply for the population, if strictly rationed, which means your people have exactly 14 days to either recapture and repair the dock intake or conduct an organized evacuation of the entire civilization to other regions where they will arrive as refugees subject to whatever terms the receiving communities choose to. Impose. The third option, attempting to survive here without the irrigation system, is not really an option at all because the desert kills unorganized bands within weeks. Your people's success has always depended on the engineering and social organization that the canals represent. Remove the canals and the Hohokam cease to exist as a distinct civilization and become just another extinct culture that the desert swallowed. Burning Sky calls a war council that includes every surviving senior defender, every village representative who made it to the fallback position, and surprisingly several of the most experienced farmers whose knowledge of crop cycles and water needs is crucial to survival planning regardless of which desperate option the council chooses. Cloud Singer is there despite being wounded in the shoulder, her voice still carrying authority as she presents the engineering assessment in terms that make the situation even more bleak than you already understood. The main intake can be repaired, but doing so will require at least 10 days of concentrated labor by skilled workers protected by fighters you don't currently have, and those workers will need water rations you can't spare because the reservoir supply is already committed to keeping the population alive. During the repair period, creating an impossible circular dependency where you need water to fix the water supply. The evacuation option is discussed with equal brutal honesty, representatives from each village calculating how many people they could realistically move the 100 miles to the nearest other major irrigation civilization. The Pima settlements to the south, and what reception they might expect when they arrive as desperate refugees, fleeing a collapsed water system. The mathematics are ugly. Only perhaps half the population could make the journey successfully given available water for the trip, and arriving communities might accept some refugees, but certainly not all, meaning the evacuation option likely means the death of 40% of your people through either failed journey or rejection by destination communities. The silence after this calculation stretches long enough that you hear individual water drops falling from irrigation gates into the reservoir below, each one sounding impossibly loud in the desperate quiet. Then Broken Tooth speaks from his stretcher where Gentle Hands is still working to stabilize him, his voice weak but carrying the authority of a man who has kept water flowing for 40 years through 3 previous drought crises. He reminds the council that the enemy force accomplished its objective of night, destroying intake infrastructure, but paid a terrible price in casualties. Doing so, likely losing more than a third of their combined raiding force, and they will not be able to sustain another major assault for at least a moon cycle while they recover and recruit new fighters. So, this creates a window where a small, fast-moving counter-raid could potentially take the intake with minimal fighting because the enemy won't be expecting immediate offensive action from a defeated defensive force. It's a desperate gamble that could result in losing the elite fighters you need to defend the reservoir, but it also might be the only option that doesn't result in civilizational collapse. Within the next 2 weeks, Burning Sky accepts Broken Tooth's strategic assessment and begins planning the counter-raid immediately because delay only makes the situation worse, and you volunteer for the mission before he even finishes outlining the composition of the force, knowing that you cannot stay behind and guard the reservoir while others attempt the desperate gamble that might save your civilization. The raid force will be just 20 fighters, all younger and uninjured volunteers, because speed and surprise are the only advantages you can leverage against an enemy that still significantly outnumbers your total remaining combat capability. The plan is audaciously simple. March through the night to reach the intake by dawn. Launch a sudden assault banking on the enemy being relaxed after their victory and not expecting immediate counterattack. Recapture the site and hold it just long enough for 10 engineers, including Cloudsinger, to assess what repairs are actually feasible. Then retreat again before enemy reinforcements can arrive from their main encampment. You spend the hours before departure checking your weapons and trying to eat food. Your stomach doesn't want while Gentle Hands treats your various injuries with the same herb mixtures she's been using for decades, and she tells you in her ancient voice that you're either very brave or very stupid, and she's not certain which, but she's seen enough young warriors die over the years that she's mostly beyond grief and has moved into a kind of resigned acceptance that humans fight over water because water is life, and life is worth fighting for. She gives you a small clay pot of pain-numbing salve made from plants that grow only in specific locations and tells you to use it sparingly because she has no way to make more until the crisis ends. One way or another, and her gift feels like a blessing from someone who has seen the entire span of your civilization's rise and might now witness its fall, decaying. The night march to the intake is brutal in ways that have nothing to do with enemy contact and everything to do with moving fast through darkness over terrain that wants to break ankles and hide rattlesnakes in every shadow, and you're grateful for Quick Rabbit scouting skills as she ranges ahead, finding the safest paths through the treacherous landscape. The moon is waning toward darkness, which provides excellent concealment but terrible footing, and twice members of your group nearly fall into arroyos that would have resulted in broken bones and mission compromise. You move in practice silence, the only sounds being the soft scuff of leather on stone and the occasional whispered warning about obstacles ahead. And the discipline of your small force is impressive because everyone understands that a single cry of pain, or clatter of dropped weapon could alert enemy patrols and turn this calculated raid into a massacre. Quick Rabbit freezes ahead of the main group and gives the danger signal, a specific hand gesture visible even in the darkness, to eyes trained to watch for it, and everyone drops prone behind whatever cover is available while she ghost crawls back to report. In a whisper so quiet you can barely hear despite her being right beside you. Enemy patrol ahead, she reports. Just 3 fighters who appear to be more concerned with staying awake than actually watching for threats. Positioned at the bend in the wash, about 200 paces from your current location, Burning Sky makes the tactical decision instantly. Your force will bypass the patrol entirely by detouring through rougher terrain, rather than risk combat that might alert the main enemy camp, accepting the additional hour of delay and increased injury risk as preferable to losing the critical advantage of surprise. The detour is agonizing, picking your way through a boulder field in near total darkness, while knowing that every minute brings you closer to dawn, and the moment when surprise becomes impossible, and you personally help 3 different fighters navigate past obstacles that would have injured them. Your familiarity with this terrain from years of canal, giving you an unexpected tactical advantage. You finally reach the position overlooking the intake structure as the eastern ski just begins to show the first gray hint of approaching dawn. And what you see makes your heart sink because the enemy has left a larger guard force than expected. At least 15 fighters visible in the growing light, which means your surprise assault will be against nearly equal numbers, rather than the overwhelming advantage you were counting on for quick success and minimal casualties. Burning Sky gathers the raid leaders, including yourself, for a whispered tactical conference. And the revision to the plan is necessarily simple because complex strategies fall apart in the chaos of actual combat, and you have perhaps 20 minutes before there's enough light for the enemy guards to spot your force on the overlooking position. The assault will be in 2 groups, the main force of 15 fighters attacking directly from the east, where you currently are positioned, while 5 fighters, including you in Quick Rabbit Circle, to attack from the west, creating confusion about force size and direction. The goal remains unchanged. Seize the intake long enough for Cloudsinger to assess repair feasibility, then retreat but now that assessment window might be measured in minutes rather than the hour you were hoping for, and those minutes must be purchased with blood. You lead your 5-person flanking group through the pre-dawn darkness, circling wide around the intake to approach from the unexpected direction, and Quick Rabbit scouts the path with supernatural skill that you make. A mental note to properly acknowledge if you both survive the next hour. You reach position just as dawn light begins to paint the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink that would be beautiful under any other circumstances, and you wait for Burning Sky's signal with your heart hammering so hard you're certain the enemy can hear it across the 100 paces, separating your position from theirs. The enemy guards are changing watch shifts, the night crew obviously exhausted, and the day crew not yet fully alert, and you realize Burning Sky has timed the assault for exactly this vulnerable transition moment when defenders are at their worst readiness. The signal comes as a stone thrown high that clatters down near the enemy position from an unexpected direction, causing all 15 guards to turn toward the sound. And in that moment of distraction, your main force rises from concealment and charges with war cries that shatter the dawn quiet and cause several enemy fighters to freeze in confusion for precious seconds. Your flanking group hits them from behind simultaneously, your war club connecting with an enemy warrior's back before he even knows you're there, and the initial assault goes better than you dared hope, as 4 enemies go down in the first few seconds of confused fighting. But then training and instinct take over for the surviving enemy fighters, and they form a defensive cluster back-to-back that's much harder to overwhelm, and the battle shifts from surprise attack to grinding combat where your numerical equality means neither side can achieve decisive advantage. The combat degenerates into the kind of grinding battle of attrition that favors neither side, but slowly bleeds both. And you find yourself trading blows with a Salada warrior who is neither particularly skilled nor particularly clumsy, just competent and determined to not die here. And you realize you're essentially evenly matched, which means this individual fight could go either way, based on tiny factors like who slips on loose stone first, or whose exhaustion makes them slow by a critical fraction of a second. Around you, similar individual battles play out, while Quick Rabbit darts through the chaos, performing her assigned role of disruption, throwing stones at enemy fighters to distract them at crucial moments. And you see one enemy warrior go down when Quick Rabbit's thrown rock catches him square in. The temple at the exact instant he was committed to an attack against one of your people, saving that fighter's life with a lucky shot that she will later describe as completely intentional. Then everything shifts when Cloudsinger arrives at the battle site with her engineering team, not staying safely back as planned, but instead walking calmly into the middle of the ongoing combat, with such confident authority that several fighters on both sides actually pause in their struggles to watch. This older woman in Canal Keeper's regalia stride past them toward the damaged intake structure, like she has every right to be there, and the fighting is merely an inconvenience to be ignored. She begins her running her hands over the damaged gates and collapsed channels with practiced touches that read structural integrity through fingertips, and you realize she's gambling that neither side will deliberately strike down an unarmed elder during combat, that some deep cultural respect for engineering masters transcends immediate tribal hostilities, and her gamble appears to be working as fighters on both sides instinctively give her space. The stalemate of individual combat breaks when Burning Sky's horn signals retreat and your force begins disengaging with practiced efficiency, each fighter backing away from their opponent while maintaining defensive position, and the enemy lets you go because they too are exhausted, and bloodied and seizing a burned-out intake isn't worth pursuing your retreat. Cloudsinger finishes her assessment and walks back toward your retreating force with the same unshakable calm she brought to the battle. And when she reaches your position, she reports in a voice barely raised above conversational tone that the main intake gate is repairable, but the distribution channel suffered structural damage that will require complete reconstruction of a 50-pace section, and her estimate is 15 days of labor by 20 skilled workers. If conditions are optimal, which of course they are not, because now you're carrying 3 wounded fighters, including one who took a deep spear thrust to his abdomen that gentle hands will probably not be able to save, and the knowledge that you're watching someone die slowly while trying to get him to help that likely can help hangs over the march like the vultures that are already beginning to circle overhead, sensing imminent Carrion. You take a turn, carrying the gut-wounded fighter with another raider, feeling his blood soak warm through your clothing and his breathing become increasingly shallow and rapid, and you try to offer comfort through words you don't believe about how gentle hands has saved worse injuries, though everyone, including the dying man, knows you're lying, and he deserves the comfort of the lie more than the cruelty of truth. Quick Rabbit scouts the return route more carefully than the outbound march because now you're moving slower and the enemy has had time to potentially set up ambush positions or pursuit forces, and twice she detects enemy presence ahead and guides your group on wide detours that avoid contact, her young face showing the strain of responsibility, but her skills proving absolutely critical to mission success. When you finally reach the reservoir position in late morning, the gut-wounded fighter has stopped breathing and you're carrying a corpse the last 200 paces because no one wants to leave him behind for the desert scavengers, even though intellectually everyone knows he's gone and his body is just meat now that will rot regardless of whether it rots in the desert or receives proper funeral rites. Broken Tooth is still alive when you return. Though Gentle Hands reports his fever from wound infection is worsening and his survival is no longer certain, and the news hits you harder than you expected because you've always assumed your uncle would survive anything through sheer stubbornness. Cloudsinger presents her assessment to the emergency council that forms immediately upon your return, and her report contains the death sentence for your civilization in the emotionless technical language of engineering analysis. The repairs are feasible but require resources and time. You do not have 15 days of labor by 20 skilled workers requiring daily water rations of approximately 4 liters per person per day in the current conditions, which totals 1,200 liters of water committed purely to repair labor, not counting the existing population. Our survival needs, or the water required for the repair materials themselves, such as mixing clay mortars. The reservoir holds approximately 20,000 liters total, and current consumption rates for the gathered population mean complete depletion in exactly 10 days. So committing water to repairs means choosing which portion of the population gets to survive and which portion dies of thirst while watching others drink their lives away in service of a maybe functional irrigation system. The impossible mathematics of survival lead to the most difficult decision in your civilization's history, and you watch it unfold during 3 hours of debate that exhausts everyone more thoroughly than the combat did, because, at least in combat, the choices are simple and immediate, while this decision requires consciously choosing which members of your community will live and which will be sent into the desert to die so the others have enough water to attempt the repairs that might save some portion of your culture. The council eventually settles on a compromise that satisfies no one, but seems less monstrous than the alternatives. The workforce for repairs will be volunteers who understand they're accepting reduced survival odds in exchange for the chance to save their civilization, and the remaining population will be reduced through a combination of voluntary evacuation by those strong enough to attempt reaching the Pima settlements, and involuntary exile of those who were already under judgment for water theft during the drought rationing period. You volunteer for the repair crew without hesitation because the alternative is watching from safety while others sacrifice themselves, and because you possess the canal, keeping skills that make you genuinely useful for reconstruction work rather than just another body consuming precious water rations. And because after years of maintaining the system, you cannot stomach the thought of abandoning it, even when abandoning it might be the rational choice for personal survival. 19 others volunteer, including Cloudsinger, who is elderly and injured, but possesses irreplaceable knowledge. Stonefist, who can barely walk on his mangled leg, but knows the intake structure better than anyone alive. And surprisingly Quick Rabbit, who argues with fierce logic that she consumes less water than adult workers, and can perform support roles that free up skilled labor for actual reconstruction. And her inclusion is accepted because in desperate times, you use every resource available, regardless of age or tradition. The voluntary evacuation group departs at sunset, approximately 40 people, including families with young children who have the best chance of completing the journey and being accepted as refugees. And you watch them walk into the desert carrying minimal water supplies and maximum hope, knowing that perhaps half will die along the way and the survivors will become absorbed into other communities and cease being distinctly Hohakam within a generation. The involuntary exiles are escorted away. The next morning, 12 individuals whose water theft during rationing period has now been reframed as literal treason against the civilization's survival. And while you understand the mathematics that demand their exile, you cannot watch as their marched beyond the defensive perimeter and their cries for mercy fade into the desert distance. So you busy yourself with organizing repair equipment and pretend you can't hear what's happening. 50 paces away, the repair work begins the next dawn with the 20 volunteers, plus a security force of 10 fighters who will protect the worksite from potential enemy interference. And the march back to the intake structure feels surreal because you essentially returning to the site of recent combat to perform careful, patient engineering work, while knowing that any day could bring another attack that ends everything. The damaged intake looks even worse in the clear light of not detailed examination than it did during Cloudsinger's combat assessment, with the main gate structure partially collapsed where enemy warriors systematically destroyed the tor wooden framework that held the stone and brush components in proper position, and the distribution channel showing a complete washout of the carefully graded earthen bed. That took your ancestors decades to build and calibrate to perfect flow rates. Cloudsinger organizes the repair work with the practiced efficiency of someone who has managed large projects for decades, dividing the 20 volunteers into specialized teams based on skills and physical capabilities. You're assigned to the distribution channel reconstruction team because your years of section maintenance have given you an intimate understanding of proper grading and soil composition, and you find yourself working alongside Stonefist, who has elevated his injured leg on a support frame. So, he can direct the work without standing, but remain present to provide technical expertise that no one else possesses. Quick Rabbit becomes the water carrier and tool runner, a role that sounds menial but proves critical because she can fetch needed items and supplies in half the time any adult could, effectively multiplying the efficiency of every worker she supports. The work is brutally hard in ways that combat never prepared you for. The grinding labor of moving earth and stone in precise, small increments, rather than the explosive violence of battle, and you find new respect for the ancestors who built this system originally, using nothing but knowledge and determination and centuries of accumulated small improvements. By the end of the first day, you've reconstructed perhaps 10 paces of the 50-pace damage section, a ratio that makes the 15-day timeline seem optimistic, even under ideal conditions, and the conditions are far from ideal as afternoon temperatures climb to levels that force work stoppages every hour so people can rest in shade and accept tiny water rations that barely offset the trisance, the sweeting dehydration of hard physical labor under a sun that seems personally offended by human ambition. Days 3 through 7 of the repair work blend together in a haze of physical exhaustion and mounting desperation. As the reconstruction proceeds slower than Cloud Singer's timeline predicted due to complications that only became apparent once actual work began. The soil composition in certain sections is wrong for stable canal construction and must be replaced with material carried from a quarter-mile away. The remaining wooden support posts from the original gate structure are more damaged than initial assessment revealed, and several must be completely replaced, and critically the water table has dropped so low during the drought that the river no longer flows with enough volume to properly test repair work, which means you're essentially guessing whether the reconstructed channels will function properly once water turns. You push through the fatigue and doubt because stopping means certain death for everyone, and you learn to work in a semi-conscious state where your hands continue proper techniques even when your mind has long since surrendered to exhaustion. Broken Tooth dies on the 5th day, his wound infection finally overwhelming his body despite Gentle Hand's best efforts, and you receive the news while covered in mud and halfway through digging a particularly difficult section that must be completed before nightfall, or the previous day's work will be undermined by overnight temperature changes. You cannot stop to properly grieve because the mathematics of survival don't allow for personal emotion on the necessary timeline. So you simply absorb the information that your uncle and teacher is gone and keep digging, promising yourself you'll properly honor his memory after the work is complete, if you survive to see completion. Quick Rabbit brings you extra water that evening from her own ration, a gesture that could literally be giving her life to comfort your grief, and you accept it because refusing would dishonor her sacrifice, and because you need the hydration to continue working tomorrow. On the 7th day, enemy scouts are spotted on the ridges overlooking the work site, a clear indication that the Salado and Sinagua forces have recovered enough to potentially launch another attack, and this threat forces a brutal recalculation of the repair timeline. Burning Sky arrives with grim news that intelligence from refugees who pass through both enemy territories suggests a combined force is forming for another assault within the next 3 to 4 days, meaning your 15-day repair timeline has been cut in half by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Cloud Singer calls an emergency meeting of the work crews and lays out the new reality. You must complete the critical structural repairs within 3 days maximum or abandon the attempt entirely. And retreat to the reservoir for a last-stand defense that everyone knows will end in total defeat because you'll run out of water before the enemy runs out of patience. You're working on the final critical section of channel reconstruction when Quick Rabbit brings news that shifts everything. Runners from the reservoir report that the water level has dropped below the critical minimum threshold 2 days earlier than predicted due to seepage and evaporation rates being higher than calculated, which means the remaining population has perhaps 18 hours of survival time, remaining before total dehydration becomes irreversible. Even if water supplies are restored, this creates an impossible situation where the repair work is approximately 90% complete, but that final 10% will require at least 30 more hours of work to ensure proper function, and attempting to use an improperly completed irrigation system could result in catastrophic failure that destroys the entire structure, requiring complete reconstruction that becomes impossible without water for the workers performing the reconstruction, a circular dependency of doom that has no obvious solution. Stone Fist makes the command decision that you're going to test the incomplete system immediately, despite the risks, calculating that a partially functional water flow is better than no water flow, and that you can continue fine-tuning repairs while initial water is already moving toward the reservoir. And his decision means you might be about to witness either the salvation of your civilization or its final destruction when improperly installed components fail under actual flow pressure. The fighters guarding your work site are positioned to delay the approaching enemy force that scouts confirm is now definitely moving toward your location and will arrive within approximately 12 hours. And you realize you're about to experience combat and engineering crisis simultaneously, a perfect storm of every nightmare scenario that could destroy what remains of the Hohokam people, allow the Gila River's diminished flow to enter the reconstructed channels system. And you hold your breath along with everyone else as water begins trickling through the dock, opening with agonizing slowness that seems to mock the desperate urgency of your situation. For 10 terrible seconds, nothing happens except that trickle, and you begin to think the gradient calculations were wrong, or a blockage exists somewhere in the reconstructed sections. But then the water finds its proper path and begins flowing with increasing volume, and the sound of water moving through the mother canal again after days of drought-imposed silence is perhaps the most beautiful thing you've ever heard, a liquid whisper that carries the promise of continued survival if the hastily completed repairs hold under the pressure. The water reaches the first major test point, a section where you had to completely rebuild the channel bed using imported soil, and you watch with clenched jaw as the flow hits that section and continues smoothly without breaching or diverting, the reconstruction holding exactly as Cloud Singer's engineering calculations predicted, despite being executed by exhausted workers operating beyond normal safety parameters. A ragged cheer goes up from the work crew, people embracing and crying with relief that surprises you with its intensity because you've been so focused on the work that you hadn't fully processed the emotional weight of potential failure until success became actual rather than theoretical. But the celebration is cut short by the war horn blast from the perimeter guards. The approaching enemy force has been spotted cresting the ridge, approximately 2 miles distant, and you have perhaps 30 minutes before combat begins. Stone Fist immediately reorganizes everyone. The engineering work is complete enough that water is flowing toward the reservoir and will arrive there in approximately 4 hours given current flow rates and the distance involved. So the new mission is simply to delay the enemy long enough for that water to reach the desperate population waiting at the defensive position. He divides the group into fighters and non-combatants, and you find yourself among the fighters along with 12 others, including Quick Rabbit, who absolutely refuses to retreat with the non-combatants despite your furious arguments that she's done enough and deserves to survive. Cloud Singer leads the non-combatants on an immediate retreat toward the reservoir, her elderly body barely functioning, but her will still iron strong, and you watch her go, knowing you might never see her again, but grateful she'll live to teach future generations if your delaying action succeeds long enough for the water to save those who remain behind. The defensive position you establish is necessarily crude compared to the prepared fortifications at the reservoir, just whatever natural rock formations and hastily piled stones can provide cover for 13 fighters against an enemy force you estimate at 60 to 70 warriors who are well rested and properly hydrated, while your group is operating on fumes and desperation. Stone Fist positions himself at the central command point despite being completely unable to stand, now his infected leg having swollen to nearly twice its normal size. dot, and radiating heat that you can feel from 2 paces away, and he directs the defensive placement with the calm expertise of someone who has survived 3 decades of desert warfare by never panicking regardless of how bad the tactical situation becomes. He places you and Quick Rabbit together at a flanking position, where your combined skills of combat experience and her supernatural speed might create disproportionate impact against the enemy's numerical advantage. The enemy force approaches with confident swagger that suggests they fully understand the mathematical advantage they possess, and you recognize their war chief as the same massive Sinagua warrior you fought during the previous intake battle, the one you struck in the groin but clearly didn't disable permanently, though he is moving with a slight limp that gives you savage satisfaction despite your current desperate circumstances. He halts his force at about 200 paces and sends forward a single negotiator, a common practice that allows both sides to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. If terms can be reached, and you wonder what terms could possibly be offered when the stakes are literally the survival of your entire civilization versus the survival of theirs, all competing for water resources that the drought has made insufficient for multiple communities. The negotiation is brief and brutal in its clarity. The enemy offers to allow your fighters to retreat unharmed in exchange for permanent control of the intake structure, which would essentially mean your people surrender the entire irrigation system, and accept refugee status in whatever communities will accept you, abandoning centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge and social organization to become landless wanderers at the mercy of others' hospitality. Stone Fist's response is equally brief and delivered in a voice that carries across the distance with surprising strength for a dying man. Your civilization was built on the principle that water belongs to those with the skill and determination to manage it properly, and you do not surrender that principle to raiders who destroy rather than build, who take rather than maintain, and who cannot imagine the decades of patient labor required to create something as sophisticated as the canal system they're attempting to steal. The battle begins when the enemy war chief realizes that Stone Fist has rejected their terms completely, and the first wave comes exactly as you expected because you've studied this war chief's tactics during previous engagements and know he favors the same 3-wave approach that worked during the drought season battle, sending expendable fighters first to reveal defensive positions and probe for weaknesses. But this time you're ready for the tactic and have pre-positioned yourself and Quick Rabbit to specifically counter it, letting the first wave engage the main defensive positions, while you two circle through a hidden approach that Stone Fist identified during his initial terrain assessment, bringing you behind the enemy's committed first wave where you can attack their flank and rear with devastating effect precisely because they're not expecting counter-maneuver from a numerically inferior defending force. Your attack from behind catches 5 enemy warriors completely by surprise, and Quick Rabbit's spear takes one in the back before he even knows she's there. Her thrust delivered with technique you taught her during training sessions that now saves both your lives as that warrior goes down without alerting his companions. You engage 2 others simultaneously while Quick Rabbit sprints away to another position, her speed allowing her to be everywhere and nowhere in the confusing swirl of combat, and you manage to disable both your opponents through careful targeting of knees and ankles, rather than attempting killing blows that require more strength than your exhausted body can currently generate. The first wave breaks faster than it should because your flanking action creates confusion about the defender's actual numbers and positions, and you see the enemy war chief screaming orders at his second wave to be more cautious, which means your tactic bought precious time even though it can't. Be repeated. Now that the enemy knows to watch for it, you retreat back to the main defensive position, breathing so hard you can barely function. And Stonefist gives you a nod that communicates more pride than any words could convey, and you realize he specifically positioned you for that flanking opportunity, knowing your canal keeper training had not taught you to read terrain for water flow, which translates directly to reading terrain for tactical movement. Quick Rabbit returns moments later, having led 3 pursuing enemies into a section of loose rock that caused 2 of them to fall and injure themselves, showing that she absorbed every lesson about using environment as weapon. And Stonefist actually laughs at her report, despite his fever and pain, a sound so unexpected in the current circumstances that several defenders turn to stare. Before refocusing on the enemy force that's reforming for the second assault wave, committed his best fighters to ending this quickly. And suddenly you're fighting for your life against opponents who are fresher, better fed, better hydrated, and frankly more skilled than you are in your current depleted condition. And survival becomes a moment-by-moment calculation of reading attacks and responding with minimal energy expenditure. Because you simply don't have reserves left for elaborate defensive moves or powerful counterstrikes. A Salado warrior pins you against a rock face with his superior reach and conditioning, and you know you're about to die when Quick Rabbit appears from nowhere and hamstrings him with her knife, the family blade you gave her weeks ago now, saving your life in the most literal possible way. And the warrior goes down screaming, and you finish him with a strike you immediately feel guilty about, because killing a disabled opponent violates every cultural norm you were raised with. But Stonefist's voice cuts through your hesitation, reminding everyone that honor is a luxury for societies with surplus resources, and you are a civilization fighting for existence where only survival matters. The defensive line begins to collapse, not from enemy breakthrough, but not from simple physical failure, as defenders literally cannot continue fighting. Muscles cramping from dehydration and exhaustion, and you watch helplessly as one of your companions simply sits down in the middle of combat and waits to die because his body has surrendered, even though his mind hasn't, and an enemy warrior kills him almost gently, as if understanding that the desert has already defeated this man, and the killing blow is just confirming what thirst and exhaustion already accomplished. 3 other defenders fall in quick succession, and suddenly your 13 has become 9, and the mathematics of the defensive position shift from difficult to impossible, and you realize Stonefist is about to order a fighting retreat that will cost more lives, but might allow a few survivors to escape into the desert. But then everything changes when a war horn sounds from an unexpected direction, and you see approximately 30 fresh Hohokam fighters cresting the ridge behind the enemy force. And you recognize the lead warrior as Warchief Burning Sky, who somehow organized a relief column from the reservoir despite the water situation being even more desperate there, and his force crashes into the enemy's rear with the shock value of unexpected reinforcements, multiplying their actual combat effectiveness. The enemy formation breaks, almost not from being defeated, but from suddenly being trapped between 2 forces and facing the real possibility of total encirclement and annihilation, rather than the easy victory they were anticipating. And their war chief makes the tactically sound decision to retreat. While his force is still intact enough to retreat effectively, they disengage and withdraw toward the north in organized fashion that prevents pursuit, carrying their wounded and covering their retreat with disciplined rearguard action. And you realize you're watching experienced warriors who know when to fight and when to preserve force for future engagements. The relief force's arrival saves your lives, but the cost becomes apparent immediately after the enemy retreat. Of your original 13 defenders, only 7 survive, including yourself, Quick Rabbit, and Stonefist, who is now clearly hours from death but conscious enough to report to Burning Sky on the successful repair completion and water flow toward the reservoir. Burning Sky explains that he brought the relief force in a desperate gamble after scouts reported your water had begun flowing into the reservoir distribution system approximately 1 hour ago, ahead of Cloud Singer's calculations, thanks to her conservative timeline estimates, and that initial water allowed him to properly hydrate a fast-moving relief column that made the journey in half the normal time through forced march that would have killed participants if attempted while dehydrated. The mathematics of that decision are brutal. He gambled that the water would arrive in time to save some defenders at the intake, while accepting that if the water had been delayed even 30 minutes, his relief force would have arrived to find everyone dead and themselves too exhausted to defend against an enemy retreat that might have turned into counter. Bambush. Stonefist dies while you're carrying him back toward the reservoir on a makeshift stretcher, his body simply giving out after holding together through sheer will. Long enough, to complete his life's work of keeping water flowing to his people, and you feel his weight change in that indefinable way that distinguishes a living person from a corpse even before checking confirms he's gone. You continue carrying him, because leaving him for the desert scavengers is unthinkable regardless of the practical difficulties of transporting the dead, and because his knowledge and sacrifice deserve the honor of proper funeral. No, writes within the community he spent his entire adult life protecting. Quick Rabbit walks beside the stretcher in silence, and you notice she's carrying Stonefist's war club, along with her own weapons, having claimed it as memorial the way warriors throughout history have claimed the weapons of honored fallen as both remembrance and promise to continue their legacy. The journey back to the reservoir takes most of the night, despite the relief force being relatively fresh, because the 6 wounded survivors of the intake defense simply cannot move faster, and you refuse to leave anyone behind. After losing so many, and dawn finds your exhausted column staggering into the reservoir defensive position where the water level has risen by perhaps 2 feet, a visible marker of the irrigation system's restored function. That means survival is now possible, rather than certain death being the only remaining option. Cloud Singer meets you at the entrance looking decades younger than she did during the repair work, properly hydrated and rested, and she immediately takes command of organizing medical treatment for the wounded, while simultaneously directing teams to begin the next phase of canal system restoration, the secondary repairs and optimizations that will be needed to return the system to full functionality, but can now be completed at a sustainable pace, rather than the desperate rush that characterized the critical repairs. The weeks following the successful defense and repair become a period of cautious reconstruction, both physical and social, as your diminished but surviving population works to restore the irrigation system to full functionality while simultaneously rebuilding the community structures that were strained nearly to breaking by the desperate choices required during the crisis. The voluntary evacuation families who departed to seek refuge with the Pima communities gradually send back word through traveling traders. Approximately 26 of the original 40 evacuees survived the journey and were accepted as refugees. Their children will be raised as Pima and will forget their Hohokam heritage. Within a generation, a price paid so the remaining Hokum culture could continue to exist in the ancestral homeland. The involuntary exiles are not spoken of. Their fate unknown and deliberately not investigated because the community conscience cannot bear examining too closely what happened to the 12 individuals sacrificed to the mathematics of water rationing, though sometimes at night you hear quiet weeping from families who lost members in you. The social cost of survival will take years or decades to fully heal. You are promoted to Master Canal Keeper to replace Stone Fist, a position you accept with profound reluctance because you feel too young and inexperienced for the responsibility. But Cloudsinger explains that the traditional path to Master Keeper status has been disrupted by the crisis deaths and the civilization cannot afford to leave critical positions unfilled while waiting for ideal candidates to mature through normal progression. Quick Rabbit becomes your primary apprentice despite being even younger than typical apprentice age because she demonstrated capabilities during the crisis that surpass most adult workers, and because the cultural traditions around age and gender roles have been permanently altered by the desperate circumstances that required everyone to contribute regardless of traditional restrictions. You find yourself teaching her the advanced techniques of gradient calculation and structural assessment that Stonefist taught you, and you notice she absorbs the knowledge with the same intensity you brought to Broken Tooth's lessons, and you realize this is how civilizations persist through catastrophe, by passing knowledge forward, even when the traditional teachers are gone. The drought finally breaks in the autumn when unusual weather patterns bring heavy rains. Don't grow. Draco, but that swell the Gila River back toward normal levels and allow the irrigation system to operate at full capacity for the first time since the crisis began, and the relief is so profound that people literally dance in the rain despite cultural norms that typically discourage such overt emotional displays. The fields that were abandoned during the worst of the water shortage are replanted, and you walk through the growing crops with Cloudsinger, who points out that the Three Sisters planting technique your people have perfected over centuries is more efficient than anything the Salado or Sinagua have developed, and this agricultural productivity gap is why they raid rather than compete successfully, and why your civilization will ultimately prevail despite the devastating costs paid during the drought, because engineering knowledge compounds generation after generation while raiding provides only temporary resource transfer without building lasting capability. 3 years after the crisis, your civilization has not only recovered, but expanded its irrigation system beyond pre-drought capacity, incorporating new engineering techniques developed during the desperate repair work and implementing social organizational improvements that emerged from the harsh lessons of survival triage. You're now recognized as one of the premier canal engineers in the entire Hohokam territory, having designed and built 2 entirely new canal branches that serve previously unwatered land, and your methods are studied by apprentices from other villages who travel specifically to learn from someone who rebuilt the mother canal under impossible conditions and lived to refine the techniques. Quick Rabbit has grown into a formidable canal keeper in her own right. Her combination of speed, intelligence, and combat capability making her valuable in both maintenance and defense roles, and she's begun taking her own apprentices who will carry the knowledge forward into the next generation. The Salado and Sinagua tribes never recovered from their casualties during the drought war and have gradually been absorbed into other communities or migrated to regions with more reliable water sources, removing the constant raiding threat that characterized your entire adult life. Up to this point, this doesn't mean peace exactly, because humans always compete for resources, and the desert still offers barely enough for one thriving civilization. But it means the nature of competition has shifted from violent raids toward economic and social interaction, trade relationships and marriage alliances, and the gradual cultural blending that happens when proximity and shared interest overcome historical hostility. You find yourself in council meetings discussing water sharing agreements with former enemies, negotiations that would have been unthinkable before the crisis, but now seem not just possible, but necessary for regional stability that benefits everyone through reduced warfare costs and increased agricultural cooperation. Tonight, as the sun sets over the irrigation system you've dedicated your life to protecting and improving, you walk the canals with the same attentive listening you learned from Broken Tooth 20 years ago, and you can hear in the water's whisper the accumulated knowledge of generations who built this system increment by increment, who defended it battle by battle, who died to preserve it, and whose deaths purchased the survival of everyone living now in these desert communities that should not exist by any rational calculation, but persist through engineering genius and social organization, and the kind of desperate courage that emerges when the only alternative to success is complete annihilation. The water flows as it has for centuries and will continue flowing for night. Centuries more if each generation accepts the responsibility of maintenance and defense, which passes forward unbroken. If young people like Quick Rabbit embrace the calling of keeping water flowing through an unforgiving desert that separates human ambition from human survival by the precise gradient of a properly constructed canal, you understand now what Stonefist knew and what Cloudsinger taught, and what your entire civilization embodies through its existence, that the true engineering marvel isn't the 700 miles of canals or the sophisticated intake structures or the perfect gradient calculations, but rather the social system that motivates humans to cooperate on time scales, spanning generations, to sacrifice present comfort for future stability, to defend communal resources with personal blood, and to pass knowledge forward through unbroken chains of teaching that outlast individual lives and accumulate into civilizations that rival anything Rome or any other empire ever accomplished, built not through slave labor and military conquest, but through free citizens who understood that survival in harsh environments requires each person to be simultaneously engineer, warrior, teacher, and student in a never-ending cycle that defines civilization itself.